if you had the power to take a series of steps to protect the United States, given the risks that are known and those that are unknown, what would be the advice that you would give to this committee on what we should do to protect the United States?
I think it's conceptually simple and actually doable politically. You should prepare for enactment right after the elections later this year, 2013, a budget plan which simultaneously provided some support to economic growth in the short run by continuing, for example, the payroll tax cuts for another year or so, but, and that's the huge but, put into place concrete, tangible measures that would reduce the budget deficit to achieve the 50 or 60% debt GDP ratio over the next 5 to 7 years. And I don't mean procedures like you did last summer, where you commissioned certain deficit reductions supposed to be going on now, set up a super committee, and put in place sequestration. What that did was put in place procedures, not budget correction. So I think you need to actually vote 2 or 3 major measures that would phase in over a 5 to 10-year period and concretely reduce the budget deficit to the targeted limit over that time. For example, Social Security reform, where you would change the indexation formula, increase the retirement age, maybe 1 or 2 other elements to that, which would by definition phase in over a number of years, which is what you want, but would take 1 to 1.5% of budget deficit, of GDP off the budget deficit over that time, which is the markets want to hear. That's one. Secondly, if you could agree on some revenue increases, which I think will be necessary as part of the package, then you come up with the kind of tax change that's necessary to do that and phase it in over 10 years. So it has a gradual impact on the economy, can be accommodated by the private sector, not disrupt either growth or their business transactions because it's phased in, but get to an end point which has a significant impact in reducing the budget deficit. If you could find similar measures on the health care side, obviously be desirable to do that. The point being, however, to actually vote substantive, tangible, concrete measures, put them in law that sets you on a path to phase in the budget correction over the desired time period. That, it seems to me, squares the short term with the longer term, and I think only that will avoid the risk to our country that continuing to kick our can down the road otherwise generates.
Dr. Johnson?
So I agree that making progress on the budget would be huge, particularly in this context. The extent of fiscal adjustment that you would need to hit if you were roughly going to a 50% debt to GDP target by 2030, it's about a 6%, 6 percentage point fiscal adjustment. It's pretty large by historical standards, large relative to what the U.S. has managed to do before. The one step that, and I think there are many ideas on the table, and I don't see a lot of political traction for any of them at the moment, which is a good reason to be concerned. The one thing that you may do, depending on how circumstances evolve, is you might not extend the so-called Bush-era tax cuts. Perhaps we should start calling the Bush-Obama tax cuts, because that obviously requires agreement between both houses of Congress and the President in order to extend them. That, if I understand you don't want to go there at this point, but if you were to do that, that would be huge. If you look at that relative to the fiscal adjustment the United States needs to make, this would take the issue off the table. It's about half, maybe depending on if you really don't extend any of them, maybe slightly more than half the fiscal adjustment you'd need to make. It's not the whole story. Fred's right. There are other things that would need to be considered. I would go after many of the tax expenditures and phase them out over a decade, totally responsible. But the question is, can you communicate politically, can you communicate to the markets that I think we all agree will be looking increasingly skeptically at the United States in the future, that we can do some fiscal adjustment. We did it in the 1990s in the United States. We did it in the past, but it's somewhat distant past. the markets are going to question us. And I agree also with what both my colleagues have said, that when the markets wake up and start pushing us around, that comes very quickly. We do not get a letter saying in 90 days the markets will turn against you. Absolutely not. They turn against you very, very quickly, and we should get ahead of that. Otherwise, we'll be forced into precipitate and self-defeating austerity, which is where the Europeans are.
Let me just say the CBO told us yesterday, if we were to let all the Bush-era tax cuts lapse, and if we were to allow sequestration to proceed, as is currently in the law, that economic growth in this country would drop dramatically, that we would go from 2.2, 2.5% growth this year to just over 1% growth next year. So that kind of precipitous change, to me, does not make sense. What does make sense is to have, Fred, I like what you described, Dr. Bergsten, what you described, which is something in the short term that gives additional lift. By the way, I personally believe we should look at infrastructure. I know economists have resistance to that because of the time necessary. I'll tell you, if you told the states of this country there was going to be priority funding available for projects that have national importance in the transportation infrastructure of the United States, and you gave them a certain amount of time to obligate those funds, it would happen. But only if simultaneously you put in place a policy that made the adjustments to entitlement and, yes, revenue, that, to me, I would like the goal of balancing in 10 years. Because that would take us a long way in the direction to getting to a debt to GDP that is sustainable. Dr. Larrick, your recommendation to us.
First of all, Senator, I think that the U.S. government is lulled into a false sense of security by the level of how low interest rates are on our debt.
Right now.
Right now. It's driven by basically three factors. One, the mess in Europe, so there's no other place for international investors to place their funds. Two, the fact that the dollar is a reserve currency, so foreigners are forced to buy huge amounts of our treasuries. And finally, that the Federal Reserve is buying so many of them themselves. You have very few private investors in the United States buying U.S. treasuries. I think, going back, what is lacking in this country from a government policy standpoint is a simple program that answers 5 questions. Those questions are, what are you trying to do? How are you going to do it? Why is it going to work? How much is it going to cost? And where are you going to get the money? Right. No, Congress hasn't answered that question. The administration has not answered that question. The markets are waiting for an answer to that question. The great innovation in economic science over the last practically 50 years has been the role of expectations in how people in the economy, financial markets work. If the U.S. government were able to announce a program that answered those 5 questions, the markets would immediately, and it was credible, the markets would immediately take that expectation of future stability and give us stability today. And until we answer those questions, any stability will be short-lived and could vanish at any moment, as Mr. Johnson said.
Thank you.